Oh, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Corey Cliff. I'm a member of the Liquitote Nation. I am doing a welcome and the intros for Dr. Schaefer this evening. And leading this evening is Dr. Valentin Schaefer. He'll be doing a talk on urban biodiversity. We'd like to acknowledge with respect the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations for the traditional territory in which University of Victoria stands on, and building on a beautiful relationship between them. Dr. Schaefer, would you like to take it from here?
Oh, thanks, Corey. What I'll do is I'll start off by talking about biodiversity in general a bit, and then sort of focusing more on urban. And just to explain what you're looking at right here in terms of the first page, there are a number of different images, and the one on the lower right is actually of a stubby squid. And that stubby squid's picture was taken pretty much where the cruise ships are in southern Victoria off of Ogden Point. Next to it on the left is a paramecium. It's a single-celled organism. There's a chocolate lily next to that, and then a swallowtail butterfly, yellow swallowtail. And then the upper images are of a bull kelp forest with some sea lions next to it, taken at Steveston Jetty. And then there's a fungus, of course, then there's a Baltimore oriole, just to give some range of biodiversity. So the urban emphasis in terms of biodiversity is very important because cities tend to be located in very strategic areas, not just for people, but for biodiversity in general. That's what's drawn the people to those areas in a lot of cases. And I have an example here in terms of the Pacific Flyway for the Fraser River estuary. And of course, we're on a flyway here as well in terms of Victoria, with birds coming across the Strait of Juan de Fuca. But the other flyways that go across North America are shown in the lower right. And the Fraser River estuary does support all of these birds that are on the flyway. So anything that happens in Greater Vancouver, in Metro Vancouver, or in that region is going to have an impact on all of these birds that are sometimes from very far away. We're also on the salmon migration route, and the Fraser River estuary is the beginning of the whole Fraser River system. So all of the salmon, I don't know how many, 20 million that are in this 100 million fry and whatever that are in the system, move through the Fraser River estuary at some point. So whatever goes on in the Fraser River estuary is going to affect these salmon. And they don't just pass through, because a lot of the salmon are going to have to linger in the estuary because their metabolisms are switching over from freshwater to saltwater or saltwater to freshwater, whichever direction they're going. And the region has a lot of habitat complexity in and of itself. So here are some of the migrating birds. These are snow geese, which show up in the Fraser River Delta every November pretty much, and they leave pretty much around March. So these are largely a population from Wrangel Island in Russia that come here, and they like to hang around the potato fields and try and find whatever produce is left behind, in addition to feeding on the Fraser River estuary. This is to show the importance of salmon in terms of the Fraser River estuary. And the Fraser River is very important for the salmon. As a result of it, that was why we had some sewage treatment in the Fraser River in the 1960s already. And we were trying to maintain the oxygen levels within the Fraser River system for the salmon. We didn't have the same imperative here in Victoria. So the sewage treatment showed up in Victoria much later because it didn't have the same sort of economic impact that the sewage treatment would have in the case of Vancouver. But there are many different streams around the city itself which support salmon populations. But what I mentioned before was that the salmon throughout the whole Fraser system move through Metro Vancouver. And the region also has a lot of habitat complexity in and of itself. So there is terrestrial upland habitat in terms of the Burrard Peninsula, which is what the city of Vancouver and Burnaby and Coquitlam are on. There's also the Fraser River Delta as an upland habitat. There are the coast mountains on the north. So the coast mountains are shown as these fingers of darkness coming down off the top of the image. So I'll point to it here. We've also got the freshwater system in terms of the Fraser River. So the Fraser River splits into the main arm and the north arm, pretty much at New Westminster, and you see the freshwater coming out of the Fraser River system. It's got a lot of silt in it. This is not pollution. The silt is actually very rich in nutrients, so this is a good thing, not a bad thing. Not to say that there isn't pollution in the river, but you don't see it. It's not really visually apparent. And a major landmark here is, of course, Burns Bog. And here what you see is actually the Burns Bog landfill. So this is the major landfill for the city of Vancouver. We've also got marine habitat in the case of the Strait of Georgia, and in terms of Burrard Inlet, which is over here. So very diverse habitat type and very important in terms of salmon and in terms of migrating birds. I have this image here to show you the type of biodiversity we're looking at in terms of the planet. So in terms of the planet, there are about 10 million species that people are estimating, could be as much as 100 million. Nobody really knows. 1.5 million are actually identified and named. Most of those are insects. And so what you're looking at here in terms of this image is a hydraulic diagram where the size of the organism represents the relative abundance on the planet. So on the upper right, you see this weird organism. It's actually a beetle in flight. And the beetle has these wing covers, which are up right now, and the wings are really transparent, so you can't see them too well in this image. But you can see that the beetle's huge. And that's because 1 million of the 1.5 million species we know about are insects. So really, this planet is a planet of insects rather than people, although we tend to think of the people first. You can also notice on the lower left is this weird animal, and it's actually a mite. And we have a lot of mites on this planet as well. It's kind of puzzling because we don't really think of the mites, but they are very abundant. And if you look on this hilltop here next to the mushrooms, there's an elephant, and that elephant is representing the abundance of mammals. So in terms of biodiversity in general, the mammals don't make up a lot. But because they're close to us, we tend to think of them most. So for different levels of biodiversity, we usually think in terms of species. So species are relatively easy to appreciate in terms of biodiversity. But within species, we have these populations of individuals. And within those individuals, we sometimes have variations as well. So we see those variations in terms of fruit trees, for example, where sometimes there are branches grafted onto some good rootstock. And so you might have fruit from different trees growing on the same tree in the end. So in terms of the hierarchy, though, we're going from the individual to the population to the species to the ecosystem. So those are the different levels of biodiversity that we're talking about here. I have this image here to show that a lot of biodiversity that we see in the city has got the touch of the human hand on it. So here what we've seen are various dog breeds. So these dog breeds all came from a wolf, Canis lupus, and the dog itself is a different species. We call it Canis familiaris. But they're all variations of basically the beginnings of a wolf. And we've added all of this diversity within the city very purposefully through artificial selection. So we bred these animals to be diverse like this, just like we breed a lot of different crops to be diverse. So this isn't natural selection, this is artificial selection, and it's basically controlled by people. So because we're in a city with people, we surround ourselves with a lot of diversity, which actually was touched by the human hand. This is also diversity that was cultivated. So the various forms in the populations in plants we call cultivars. And here we see two different cultivars of the European beech tree. The European wild-type beech looks like the one on the lower right, on the right-hand side of this image. It's sort of large and bushy, but this is a cultivar, the one that's in the picture here, which has been bred to have copper-colored leaves, sort of reddish leaves. So it's a showier type of a tree and more desirable in terms of horticulture. We also have that same species bred to grow tall and narrow so that it can be planted next to a building. So this is called a columnar beech. So it's again the same species, it's Fagus sylvatica, but it has been selected to grow tall and narrow so that it can grow next to a building. And this is really important these days in terms of energy conservation because people like to plant the deciduous trees next to a building, which can shade the building in the summertime, cutting back on the energy costs of cooling the building, but will let the sunlight through in the wintertime, allowing the building to heat up through the greenhouse effect of the sunlight. We do have different types of populations which occur naturally. So it's not like a copper beech or columnar beech where there's been artificial selection. We have natural selection that does the same thing in some circumstances. And a good example of this is the lodgepole pine. So the lodgepole pine, the species name is actually Pinus contorta, which would suggest that the plant is contorted and twisted and doesn't grow in tall, straight forms that could be used to make log cabins. But that's because the tree was actually identified in the coastal form. And in the coastal form, this is the shore pine. So the shore pine and the lodgepole pine are actually the same species. And what you're looking at are genetic differences between populations, which result in these straight tall trees as opposed to the contorted ones. We see environmental impacts in terms of diversity as well. So this now is our native Garry Oak. And we see different growth forms of the Garry Oak. The one on the left, sorry, I see a typo. It should be savanna, not savanna. So this is the savanna form, which grows in deep soil. So if there's deep, rich soil, the oak will grow tall and bushy. However, a lot of the ones that grow on the coast, next to the water, are on the rocky outcroppings of Vancouver Island, and the soil is shallow there, and the growing conditions are rather harsh. So the trees tend to be stunted. So they form what we call the scrub oak. So there's a difference between the savanna oak and the scrub oak, but it's not genetic, this difference, but as in the case of the lodgepole pine and shore pine. This is due to an environmental impact on the growth of the species. I thought I would put this in here because there, in addition to just sort of straight genetics, there are modifiers that are occurring when animals are developing. And a very visual form of this is what we see in the case of a Siamese cat. So in the case of a Siamese cat, the regions of the cat which are cooler, which are the tail and the extremities on the legs and the tip of the nose and the tips of the ears, these during development will have more deposits of pigment, of melanin, than other parts of the body. So what you're looking at here in this adult cat is sort of a temperature map of the animal when it was developing. So the darkness referring to the cooler regions of the animal while it was developing. The environmental influences can be quite marked as well, which we see in the case of fish and some reptiles, where the sex actually changes. So this fish here, it's not urban, it's not an urban example, but I thought it was a good example of what I'm talking about here, is a blue wrasse, and it's a fish which is one that has groups of females that have one male that looks after them. And if the male dies, then one of the females will turn into a male. And you know, this is really quite remarkable when you think of it, having a sex change in an animal like this, but it actually happens with about 600 different species of fish. And it happens with several species of reptiles as well. So I'm sort of switching here now, going into more urban species and urban situations. And these are illustrating the fact that most of the species that we have are not adapted to living in cities. We have some which are more resistant to the urban environment than others. And these are the ones which we tend to plant when we're landscaping or if we're restoring habitat. So what I have here is a list of urban resistant conifers. So they're resistant to the drier conditions that you get in cities, the more intense exposure to ultraviolet light, but also to pollution. So many plants are very sensitive to ground level ozone. And these plants here, like these pines, are quite resistant to that. So these are species which are resistant to urban pollution. This is the European larch, the English yew, blue spruce, various cedars, junipers, and the black pine. The black pine is actually one of the preferred species of conifers to plant in the city. You see black pines all over the place. There are a lot of them on campus at the University of Victoria, and they're there because they are resistant to pollution. And the black pines have 2 needles per fascicle, 2 needles per bunch, the same as our native short pine, but the needles are very long as opposed to the short pine where they're very short. We also have resistant conifers, resistant broadleaves, so deciduous trees. So a classic one is the green ash. It's very resistant to pollution. What you have a picture of here is the tulip tree. It's called the tulip tree because you can see the flower looks like a tulip. And these are really quite remarkable when they're in bloom around June, I think it is. We have a number of these on campus at the University of Victoria outside of the main library. And really when they're in bloom, it's really, I mean, I've seen students stop dead in their tracks and sort of wonder what's going on. And then they look up and, you know, they sort of notice the flowers out of the corner of their eyes. And when you really look at it, it's quite remarkable. The European birch is another. The London plane tree is a tree that's commonly planted in cities now, and it has an interesting bark because it looks kind of diseased. It looks like it has psoriasis or something. It's sort of flaky bark, and it has quite a bit of mildew associated with it as a result. The Norway maple is a very pollution-resistant tree that's planted. And the northern red oak is from eastern North America, but it's resistant to pollution, and it's planted here as well. So here's a picture of a Norway maple. So the Norway maple comes in a form which is sort of has a reddish leaf like this, but it's also green, and it has a very long petiole. Its leaf is very distinguished from our regular type of maple leaves because of that long petiole. So this one here is actually at the University of Victoria campus. In the east, it's become invasive. So a lot of introduced species, they don't become invasive, and they sort of are benign in the landscape, and you plant them and they won't spread from there. And that's the case with the Norway maple here, in the case of Vancouver Island or Vancouver. Sorry, just had to close the door. But there have been reports that in eastern North America, they become invasive. So this is a bit of a problem because it does compete with our normal native maple trees. This is an ornamental tree. This is a Japanese cherry. This image is actually of Moss Street in Vancouver, in Victoria. It's quite famous for its cherry blossoms. And it has 2 different varieties. In the case of Moss Street, it has the Yoshinos and Kanzan. So the ones you see here are the Yoshinas, they're white. The Kanzans are pink. And what the city had done in planting these was to alternate them between the Yoshino and Kanzan varieties because each one stays in bloom about a month. So by alternating the 2 different varieties, you have a line of cherry blossoms for 2 months instead of just for 1 month a year. So with these cherry trees, and I don't know if you noticed it on the previous slide, but here, I'll just go back. If you look at the base of these trunks here, you can see there are a whole bunch of branches that are coming out from one area. And you can see there are several branches coming out from here. So these are the grafts. So here is the rootstock that was used for the tree. And these branches were taken from other trees, which provided better blossoms, better blooms. And so they were preferred for planting in the city so that they could make a much more beautiful setting. In terms of the urban forest, one of the things that we can observe is that it's a lot more diverse than a native forest. So a native forest will just have a handful, say 6 different species of common trees in the forest. In the case of the city though, you can have 40 or 50 different tree species within a couple of blocks. So in the same sort of area that you would have just a few tree species in a natural environment, you could have 40 or 50 different tree species in the city. Also, because of the changed growing conditions in the city, when we're looking at restoring forests in the city, it's not really fair to look at the climax vegetation for the city, for the region. So in the case of, say, Vancouver, the climax vegetation is a cedar hemlock forest. And you're not going to plant cedar and hemlocks in downtown Vancouver. They're just not going to work. So you need to adjust what you're planting to the growing conditions of the city itself. So here's an example of a tree tour that I put together in Victoria. So the green on the side is Beacon Hill Park, and you can see that I've extended the walk into several city streets. And if you look on the right, you see I've got 48 different trees identified. Most of them are different species, and most of them are not native. So this is a relatively small area, but it has a high diversity in terms of the biodiversity of tree life. So I'm going to switch the discussion a bit here to talk more about landscape ecology rather than species, because this is important in terms of the city. So this is what the city looks like. This is actually Coquitlam in Vancouver. It's a suburb. And you can see that there are green spaces and there are gray areas. And the gray areas are the place where there are houses and streets. The green areas are where there are parks and where there are streams. So if there's a stream, there's a setback from top of bank of 15 meters or 30 meters, depending upon the situation. And that leaves a green strip. And that's what you see here in the city. There's also a hydro corridor. And so this hydro corridor is running here, and under a hydro corridor, the high voltage lines, the 500 kilovolt lines, the ones with the big towers, you have an easement of 300 meters. So that represents a green space going through the city. That easement is there because it's not a good idea to live under high voltage power lines, so they don't allow houses to be built there. So what you end up in terms of a landscape are patches of green space, the matrix, which is the gray area here, which represents the streets and houses, and then some connectivity between those spaces in terms of the streams and say a hydro corridor. These patches have characteristics which are important. So one of the important characteristics is the shape of the patch. So here you see 3 different shapes of patches. These patches all have the same area, but if you look at what's going on, I've identified interior habitat by a dark shading. So that interior habitat is really gold. It's something that's really sought after by species which are pretty intolerant to people. And you can see that if a patch is shaped in a square or a circle, it has a lot more interior habitat than if it has an elongated shape with more edge. So the shape of the patch is important. Also, how these patches are connected to each other is important. You can have stepping stones occurring between the patches, or you can have continuous corridors connecting these patches. And that connectivity is really important in terms of how these patches will function. So if they have that connectivity and can rely on other patches for the movement of plants and animals, then they are much more robust, they are much more resilient than if they are isolated from each other. So one of the things we do in an urban area when we're doing restoration is trying to improve connectivity between patches. And the patches themselves are important in terms of the plants and animals that they can support. So when we were looking at a lot of development occurring in the early 2000s or late 1900s, and developers were really quite aggressive in terms of how much habitat they need to leave behind for parks. There was a lot of research done to see how much habitat do you actually need. And some tables were developed, including this one from a report from Environment Canada called How Much Habitat is Enough? And there were other reports as well from other places. But you can see that they identify patch sizes. There's one that's 1 hectare, and then they identify what sort of animals will occur in a 1 hectare forest patch, what sort of animals will occur in a 1 hectare marsh patch. And then if you go up to 4 hectares, you see that you attract other animals which would not survive in the smaller patches. So if the patches are bigger, or if there are a bunch of smaller patches that are connected together, then you can support more different species. Then between the patches, you have the matrix itself, and the type of matrix that you have can support different species. So here are 4 different matrix types: the urban shoreline, the inner city, buildings and shrubs, and then a mature residential area. And below that and below the pictures are tables which are showing the sorts of species which are supported by those different types of matrix. So the type of matrix you have is very important in terms of the urban biodiversity you have. So within the urban biodiversity, we have species which are either tolerant of people or avoid people, or can actually exploit the urban environment to their own ends. So these are called urban adapters if they can coexist with us, urban avoiders if they don't like us, and urban exploiters, such as this crow, that can take advantage of what we do in terms of an urban environment. So here are some examples of an urban adapter. On the bottom left is the downy woodpecker. So this is an urban adapter which is distinguished from something like a hairy woodpecker or a pileated woodpecker, which would require better habitat. So the downy woodpecker you find in your backyard because it can tolerate people like that. Similarly, the Bewick's wren is very common in James Bay and Fairfield and other parts of downtown Victoria. And you can think of other parts of the province where you might have other types of wrens which will live with people. And on the bottom right is a mallard duck. So we're all familiar with how mallards coexist with people. And the picture of these 2 female mallards was actually taken at a pond outside of the Hotel Grand Pacific in downtown Victoria. You can actually see sort of a little gold in the water here. That's a goldfish, so this is a pond. So these are urban adapters. They tend to be common, but they can also be species at risk. So what you're seeing here is the tennis courts in Stanley Park in the west end of Vancouver. And in the background, you can see a tree that's got all these sort of gnarly things in the branches. So those gnarly things are nests of great blue herons. So what you have here is a situation where you have a species at risk, blue listed in BC, the great blue heron, and its nests are all over some trees which are right by a tennis court in Stanley Park. An urban exploiter would be the northwestern crow, which I showed earlier, or a gray squirrel. So the thing about the northwestern crow is that it feeds on garbage. And so the natural checks and balances in terms of its population for having things to eat in the wild don't apply, because it can supplement its food with garbage. So it can breed very successfully and aggressively by staying healthy and having more young and feeding more young by introducing garbage into the diet. So that's not limited by what is available naturally. And what they will do then is also depress the size of other bird populations. The gray squirrels benefit from deciduous trees. So in cities, we tend to have more deciduous trees than coniferous trees. It's just sort of a preference, I guess, that people have. And the gray squirrel was introduced into Vancouver a number of times, and then Vancouver Island, and has taken hold in a number of different places. So it benefits from these trees, and its population then can expand as a result of that. And it wouldn't normally be doing that if there were the usual larger amounts of coniferous trees present. And an urban avoider is something like a warbling vireo. So this is a type of bird that requires that interior habitat that I was showing earlier in one of these earlier images. So it's pretty typical that the urban avoiders are seed-eating birds, insect-eating birds. Insect eaters require more natural habitat for a supply of insects for their diet than seed-eating birds. So cities tend to favor seed-eating birds. We also have introduced an invasive species in cities. Introduced species don't always become invasive. I guess it's not the typical path, but a lot of them do. And when they do, they become a real problem. So what I have here is a picture of some red-eared sliders. So these are the pet store turtle that people buy. And then I guess if they get tired of them, they don't want to flush them down the toilet. They would rather just let them go in the wild. And then they spread. So there's a problem with them because they can, just by being there, outcompete our Western painted turtle, our native one, but they also carry a disease. And that disease will affect our turtle, our native turtle, and depress its populations. So these red-eared sliders are actually in the pond behind the University Club at the University of Victoria. And you can also see here duckweed, which is also an invasive species. And you can also see some yellow flag poking through the water, also introduced. So this is basically a potpourri of invasive species that we're looking at. When we're talking about restoration, the question is, do we try to encourage this or discourage it? And that means that in terms of the log, there's just this one log in the pond here. Do you put more logs in to give these turtles more room, or do you take that log out and let them perish? So as I said, a lot of the introduced species are not invasive, and this is an example of one of them. This is the deodar cedar, and the deodar cedar is a very attractive urban tree in Victoria. It's planted in a lot of places, and it doesn't spread. So it's just, whatever is planted will grow, but it's not going to spread and take over the habitat. But we do have invasive species. They frequently spread from horticultural plantings of some kind. In this image here, you're seeing some purple loosestrife. So the purple loosestrife actually is from Eurasia. It's a real problem in Eastern Canada, and it's a real problem here as well. And the problem is that you see a lot of vegetation here, and you sort of wonder what the problem actually is. And the problem is that it's woody vegetation. And what it's done is it's replaced reeds and rushes. It's replaced soft vegetation, which can be eaten by waterfowl, with woody vegetation, which cannot. So it's changed the habitat type. And as a result, it's not as useful to the native wildlife. So another example is Spartina, cordgrass. I've got an image of that coming up. There's also the green crab, which has shown up and displaces our native crabs. English ivy is a real problem in a lot of urban settings. In Victoria, it's rampant. And the same is true for Himalayan blackberry. So here we can see some examples of invasive species. So the buckthorn in the left is a problem in eastern deciduous forests. It's frequently treated by burning. So it's controlled burns that they use to get rid of the buckthorn. And the Spartina is the cordgrass, which I mentioned earlier, which takes over our estuaries. So this is the Fraser River estuary and a large infestation of cordgrass, which has replaced a lot of sedges and reeds. So the Lingby sedge is the usual one that we have in the case of the Fraser River estuary. I think it's about 70% of the vegetation is that sedge. And it's a soft plant, a soft tissue, as opposed to woody. So it's more attractive to waterfowl. One of the important things when dealing with invasive species is to catch the invasions early. We see this, with COVID, not that it's invasive species, but it was spreading. So we didn't catch the invasion early. And as a result, it spread exponentially. And the same is true for a lot of invasive species. If you don't address the invasion early, then it tends to get out of control. And what you're seeing here is an invasion of the European Schaefer beetle. And the Schaefer beetle produces this grub that you see on the right, lower right. There's a dime next to it for size. And that's what the crows are after that you see on the left. So those grubs are really tasty for wildlife, and they can smell it through, the skunks that initially eat these smell it through the grass. And then what the skunks do is they will roll back the grass, sort of like turf rolls, to get at these. And then the crows, of course, see these turf rolls. They know something's going on here. And so they'll show up and they'll rip apart a lawn one beakful at a time, looking for these little grubs. And I actually was very close to ground zero for this infestation. It showed up in New Westminster, not far from where I used to live. And, there was a lot of discussion about what to do about it. It just was a few city blocks, and they didn't know what to do. And they tried some fungus, some nematodes, and they just were very slow to react. And as a result, you end up with a large infestation. I've since seen this in Seattle. I saw, these torn apart lawns in Seattle, and read up a bit and discovered that, the Schaefer beetle is down there as well. So with urban biodiversity, we're also dealing with urban infrastructure and its impacts. So urban infrastructure referring to liquid waste management, solid waste management, roads, urban runoff, transportation, the design of the city, the quality of the air, drinking water, and energy. So in terms of solid waste management, I've got this image here from Victoria of some leachate coming off of the Heartland landfill. And it looks bad, but it's just basically kitchen oils and greases. It's not motor oil. But space is very limited in terms of Victoria and Vancouver Island. And so there was a lot of discussion about draining a local lake called Heel Lake to create more space for the landfill. Victoria had multi-material curbside recycling in the early 1990s, late 80s, far before Vancouver did. And that's because it's on an island, and space is even more tight on an island than on the mainland. So the tightness of the space meant that you needed to do something in terms of recycling. What Vancouver is doing as well in terms of the space problem is to burn some of its garbage. So I think about 25% of the garbage is going through this incinerator in Burnaby. You can see a garbage truck sort of backing up here, about to dump its garbage into a large bay here, which then lifts the garbage over a wall onto a conveyor belt, which takes it into the burners. And the burners will burn the garbage, but it's not like you're burning dry cords of alder. You don't end up with just a bucket or two of ash after going through a cord of this wood. This is garbage. And when you're burning garbage, you still end up with about 20% of the original volume of that garbage after it's been burned. The problem is that all the toxins that were in that garbage have been concentrated. And as a result of that, the bottom ash that comes out of this incinerator is one of the largest point sources of toxic materials in the province. For sewage, as I mentioned before, with the salmon, Metro Vancouver was very aggressive and early in terms of dealing with its sewage. So here is the sewage drainage districts. The green here is the Annacis Island one, which is one of the largest ones. This is, the orange is the Iona one. The purple is Lulu Island, and then the orange is the Lions Gate. So you've got these 4 different drainage districts, and they've all got sewage treatment. As I mentioned, there was primary treatment in Annacis early on. It has since been upgraded to quaternary treatment, I guess. So here's the primary treatment at Annacis Island. So these are the settling ponds where the sewage is settled out. These are the digesters for the sludge that comes out of the settling out. So the big problem with sewage is the biochemical oxygen demand, which results from bacteria, which are breaking it down in decomposition. So that's the biggest threat. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't toxins in the sewage, but in terms of wildlife, the initial biggest threat is the lack of oxygen in the receiving waters of that sewage. So with primary treatment, you still end up with about 50% of the biochemical oxygen demand coming out in the effluent. So to deal with that, you have the secondary treatment. So secondary treatment here, this is again at Annacis Island. This is at the base of the Annacis Bridge. Secondary treatment began in 1998. And you can see the expense. It was $450 million. It's not cheap to go from primary treatment to secondary treatment. Inside these 4 different areas, these are big tanks of water that are receiving effluent from the primary treatment. And they have these big rotating drums that have a lot of surface area on them for bacteria to live and break down the oxygen demand, well, break down the organic matter in the sewage. And then the effluent comes out of that. It's treated with some chlorine, which makes a tertiary treatment, and then it's discharged. Here is the sewage treatment plant for Victoria, which just started this, well, 2 months ago. And as I mentioned, the imperative to have sewage treatment in Victoria was not as great as it was in Vancouver. So, I mean, the fact that Vancouver was treating its sewage in the 1960s, makes it look like, Victoria was really quite behind, but it didn't have the same pressures. Similarly, Vancouver did not have its curbside multi-material recycling until much after Victoria did, because Victoria had a problem with space because it's on an island. So it all depends on what's pressing in terms of budgets and priorities with society. So this is the sewage treatment plant in Victoria. It's at the mouth of the Inner Harbor. It's in Esquimalt, and we have tertiary treatment with this. So one of the big problems in the city is urban runoff. Most cities are at least 30% impervious surface, meaning roads and rooftops, like a downtown area, well, sort of just off the downtown. Downtowns themselves can be as much as 90%, I guess, impervious surface. But the idea is that anything that's on the blacktop, on the pavement, gets washed off and goes into the surrounding ground, and that feeds into the surrounding creeks. So that's the path that the pollutants will follow. So one of the solutions to this is to create these rain gardens. So here you can see there's a break in the curb. So there's yellow, and then there's a black plate and a break. So that break is to allow water to come off of the street and go into the ground on the other side of the curb. And this ground has been turned into a rain garden. So a rain garden has a certain structure to it. It's not just a ditch, it's not just a swale, although those are ways of dealing with road runoff. But it's got a certain composition of aggregate in it. It's got the certain composition of species. And what it also has is a drain. So the idea behind the rain garden is that it would handle 95% of the water that comes off of the road. But if there are larger rain events, you don't want to flood the built structures, the built environment around this area. So it's a dual system. It still has to have a connection with the storm drain system to handle that sort of an impact. So these rain gardens are expensive to construct, is what I'm getting at. This one here, which is by a school, I think it actually costs $70,000. And it's really hard to retrofit existing places as well because of that cost. And usually these rain gardens are installed when other road work is happening. So this one was installed because of that. You can see this road is newly paved. It was because this area was being paved. And in the case of Victoria, you see this around Hillside Mall, on Tattersall. They installed a whole host of rain gardens, but they can do that relatively cheaply because the excavators and pavers are there already because they're dealing with the road. But there is this opportunity here to deal with some of the oils and greases coming off of the road. When you're dealing with the runoff from the road, you end up with water that goes into the storm drains. And as a result, it doesn't percolate into the ground. And that means you don't have the groundwater recharge that you need during the drier summer months to feed our local creeks. So this is pretty typical here. It's something called urban stream syndrome, which you have in terms of streams in the city. This is an extreme example. This is Cecilia Creek in Victoria in the Burnside area, which is very industrial. You can see it's very degraded. So you have a lot of decreased biodiversity. There's a very high nutrient loading because the runoff from the road here is bringing a lot of nutrients in here. And there's going to be a lot of flooding here. This body of water here can actually raise up about 4 or 5 feet in the matter of maybe 2 or 3 hours during a heavy rain event. So it's really quite dramatic. And you get a lot of invasive species in the riparian area, especially blackberry and knotweed. So roads have other impacts as well, besides the urban runoff, besides the floods and droughts caused by the lack of percolation through the ground. So they create some barriers to movement. They also are a vector for spreading invasive species. There's also the road noise, which affects some species and not others. There's a whole book called Road Ecology, which details what species are affected by what sort of traffic noise. So, you know, if there's 10,000 vehicle movements at 50 miles an hour, then that has an impact, you know, that limits certain species. On the other hand, if you have a lot less, then more species can go there. So this is referring again to the impervious surface and stream health. So let me walk you through this. So the impervious surface is on the x-axis. You can see it says watershed impervious cover, and stream quality is on the y-axis on the left. And you can see that after 10% impervious cover in a watershed, you can't support sensitive ecosystems anymore. If you go from 10% to 25%, the system is impacted, but you still have some biodiversity occurring. But once you get beyond 25%, it's really a red zone. And when you get beyond 60%, you basically just have drainage. So although there might be a creek present, it's not going to support any kind of biodiversity because of all that impervious surface. So this is actually representing a threshold. So if you walk this backwards, if you walk back from the 100% to the non-supporting, you can see once you get to the 40% mark, you can start to build a stream again. So if you get less than 40% impervious surface in a watershed, then you can start to have some biodiversity again. So urban design is going to have a big impact in terms of the amount of impervious surface. And so densification is one way to cut that down. And so the whole push to have town centers and smart growth are ways to cut down on the impact of roads. I'm switching to air pollution here. So with air pollution, what we can identify are ground level problems and problems in the atmosphere. So we talked about the ozone hole a lot in the last few decades. And so we tend to think of ozone as something that's not available enough and is in short supply. But at ground level, when we're talking about ground level, there's the ozone in the atmosphere is a problem. So it's a byproduct of photochemical smog from nitrous oxides. So ground level ozone bad, stratospheric ozone good. Carbon monoxide is also a problem. Acidity is a problem. So we're looking for species that can tolerate these sorts of conditions to grow in the urban environment. Some of the prime habitat we have in the cities is the drinking watersheds. So these are protected so that we can have good drinking water. And these are the protected watersheds in Metro Vancouver. So we have the Coquitlam, Capilano, and the Seymour watersheds, which collectively have 60,000 hectares of habitat, which is pristine. So this can support a lot of biodiversity in the rest of the city. In the case of Victoria, we have Souk Lake and Goldstream and Leech. So this is a picture of Souk Lake. And what I'll do for the rest of the presentation rather quickly is to go through various types of urban habitats and some considerations for them. So I've identified forests, shrub communities, freshwater landscapes, open spaces, barren landscapes, paved landscapes, corridors, garden landscapes, and public landscapes. So what you see here is sort of a blend of terminology from landscape architecture and ecology. When I first started doing urban biodiversity research and looking at urban landscapes, you know, as I was looking at the vocabulary that was available through general ecology, and it just did not apply to urban areas in a lot of situations. So I discussed the dilemma with Maura Coyle, the Director of Landscape Architecture at the University of British Columbia, a number of times, and she suggested that I sort of have these more landscape architecture type of terms. So in terms of forests, here is one of the situations we're dealing with in terms of the life of a tree. So trees are really stressed in cities, and the average life of a tree downtown is about 7 years. This could be because of growing conditions, because you know they're paved right up to the trunk in a lot of cases, but it's also maybe people change their minds and don't want the tree there anymore, and so it gets cut down. But you can see that as you go from the downtown core to the average city site, to the best city site, to the rural site, the average lifespan of a tree increases considerably. So here are some types of forests. There are mature forest fragments, there are woodlots and linear forests. So this is a woodlot, and you would think that it doesn't really have much to contribute in terms of biodiversity, but this particular woodlot was used by a barn owl whenever it was feeding in the surrounding fields. So it didn't look like it had a role to play, but it actually did. So in terms of mature forest fragments, we do have these remnant forest ecosystems in cities. We can think of Beacon Hill Park, we can think of Mount Douglas Park in the case of Victoria, or Stanley Park in the case of Vancouver. You know, they are left behind and they are mature forest fragments. For the shrub communities, what I've done is broken out thickets from blackberry thickets and linear hedgerows, which are linear thickets. So here is an example of a hedgerow. These hedgerows here are actually in Michigan, but on the left here, what you see is in the background on the left is actually a greenhouse. And that greenhouse, the greenhouses showed up in Delta, I don't know, 30 years ago, and would put like 25 acres under glass in a very short period of time. So you had all of this field habitat, which was basically made unavailable to wildlife almost overnight. And to compensate for that, what the city required was that greenhouse operators had to plant these hedgerows. And you can see some of the plants for these hedgerows here to compensate for that. And I was involved in a number of projects for installing hedgerows. But then the companies really fought back and got rid of that requirement, so they weren't done anymore. For freshwater landscapes, what we can do is identify ponds or lakes or marshes, bogs, streams and rivers, estuaries and ditches. Here you can see a good example of a marsh. This is the Glendale Gardens Marsh. This is looking at the Coquitlam River on a steep bank next to it. And what we're doing here is we're waddling to stabilize the bank. Because these rivers are now in an urban context, there's more erosion occurring on their banks. And there has to be some effort made to stabilize those banks. And one of those efforts, in the case of the Lower Mainland, was to create these wattles to stabilize the banks. Wattles being retaining structures made of woven branches to capture soil before it goes into the water. And the branches are actually of willow and red osier dogwood, which will sprout, which will make new plants and form roots that will then stabilize the bank further. In marine landscapes, we have a mudflat situation, or we have a rocky intertidal situation. And in terms of restoration in a mudflat situation, we have eelgrass plugs. So eelgrass plugs, these look like hair plugs, you know, you see pictures of hair plugs, but this is actually eelgrass planted along the banks of the Fraser River to create more salmon habitat. With open spaces, we can identify grasslands, agricultural land, and old field habitat. So again, you know, when I was looking at the right terms for describing these spaces in ecology, I was really struggling, but the term open space really captures it quite well. So this is the Rifle Bird Sanctuary. These are some sandhill cranes at the sanctuary. This is the mom and the pop, and this is a baby. I'm actually in a blind when I'm taking this picture here. Otherwise, I would have been attacked, I'm sure. But this is where those geese were, those snow geese that I was showing you earlier on that were in the potato fields. This is where they usually hang out, is out in these eelgrass beds out here, and the sedges and rushes. Barren landscapes are often overlooked. So what I included in here are bridges, landfills, rock debris, vacant lots, and brownfields. And we have a good example of brownfield development here in Victoria in terms of our Dockside Green. But I've got this image here to show that this bridge underside, this is actually the Anastas Island bridge access point. These are I-beams underneath the bridge, and that means they have little ledges on them. And those little ledges actually are excellent places for barn owls. So I've got a picture of a barn owl here with my son holding it. So there was a place here, right there, where there was a nesting barn owl, and I would harvest the sorry, the castings from the owl, which are little balls of fur and bones, which I like to use to generate interest in children. They can dissect them and find these skulls and these bones. They cost like $2.50 a piece from a biological supply house, but I would have sort of an endless supply coming here. But the other thing that was happening with this bridge was that on the other side of it, on this face, were a whole slew of nests of cliff swallows. So here you see a bridge underside, which doesn't look like it has anything at all. And it actually is a prime habitat for barn owls and for cliff swallows. Also in a landscape architect type of framework, a paved landscape would be the buildings and pavement, container habitat, alleys, lanes, and plazas. And this is a plaza which is outside of the Bentall 2 Tower in downtown Vancouver. And I have this here because every spring there would be a female mallard with a bunch of young on this particular pond, on this fountain. And it always made the 6 o'clock news. And I thought in terms of an ambassador for promoting nature in the city, that mallard duck was doing more than I could ever do. So you know, these sorts of landscapes, you know, it doesn't look like much, but in terms of an impact on people and what they will do and value in terms of changing their values and changing their lifestyles and making decisions that favor green space in the city, this little fountain here was doing quite a lot. I'm just showing this particular example to show that you don't need a lot of habitat to be valuable to wildlife. This is actually the nest of a glaucous-winged gull in a container on a deck. We have corridors in the city. This is actually the Grandview Cut before SkyTrain was put through it. So this is a ravine, and we also have greenways and utility rights-of-way, riparian zones, and there was a railway going through well, there is a railway going through this Grandview Cut. So these are valuable corridors that we have going through the city, which actually help to connect up green spaces and backyard habitat. So wildlife that is using backyards that abut onto this or are close to it can use these greenways to disperse and go to other green spots. So riparian zones is referring to the vegetated areas next to streams and rivers. So these are prime areas for restoration projects to help support the fish that are in the stream. And one of the more valuable things that these plants do is create shade. So the shade is lowering the temperature of this water. And as a result of that, more oxygen is available to the fish that are in it. So we did a study when I was at Douglas College looking at Burn Creek Ravine, and we could demonstrate that there was this connection between increased oxygen and decreased temperature as you go through the creek. So these are garden landscapes. This is backyard foundation plantings, rooftops. So these are small examples of greenery that we have in the city, but they are quite valuable in terms of what they can offer in terms of pollinators especially. This is an example of a famous one in Vancouver. This is the rooftop garden at the Vancouver Public Library. So this was actually designed by Cornelia Oberlander. She was a famous landscape architect who was out at UBC. And public landscapes. So these are not to be overlooked. They have a lot to contribute in terms of the overall matrix of what we have in the city in terms of green space. So these are the various parks that we have and the various vest pocket parks, but also golf courses, cemeteries, post-secondary institutions, airports, and community gardens. So just as an example of that, here's a community garden. This is one in James Bay in Victoria. And you can just sort of see, that this is prime habitat for pollinators. There's a lot of nectar in here. It's good for hummingbirds. So as far as urban habitat goes, this is really quite remarkable. So just a couple of more theoretical points to make to close this off. What we have in terms of ecosystems is sort of a balance. So that balance is represented here by an infinity symbol, and you go through various stages. So if you think of succession, you could think of a grassland stage as being one of these infinity circles. Then you can think of a shrub community, and then you can think of a forest community. So the idea is that there's a balance that you have, keeping a steady state for a particular type of a community or a system. And in urban ecosystems, frequently we don't get to the point where there's a balance. So you have to pass a certain threshold. So here, this is sort of starting from nothing in the ecosystem, and it builds up slowly over time, sort of creating some memory on the site, building some biological capital on the site until you get to a certain threshold, and then you can start to progress. So you can see that you progress to a grassland, a coniferous forest, a mixed forest community, a climax community of some kind. But the point I'm trying to make is that before you can go through this progression, you have to get past this first threshold. And this is the biggest challenge that we have in urban areas, is to get past that first threshold. It typically represents about 45% ecological memory or biological capital. You can remember earlier on with stream health, there was this threshold of 40% that I was trying to point out. That seems to be a common denominator in a lot of different systems. You need to get to that 40%. So frequently in urban systems, we're not there. We're in this high part on the curve here. And what we have to do is look at other benefits in addition to the ones that are biological. And those other benefits are the social and psychological ones for people. So it's pretty well known now that, that having greenness, having quiet space, nature is reducing stress, it's benefiting health. There's a lot of push to bring nature back into the lives of our children. So having green space is used to make better connections with nature in the city, and just having people have a better quality of life. So when we make arguments for biodiversity, we often are forced to talk about it in monetary terms, but really the best terms to think of in terms of biodiversity is in terms of the social and psychological benefits to people. So that's what I have for you in terms of my presentation on urban biodiversity. Is a lot to go through. I was trying to explain the different types of biodiversity, focus more on urban, and then some of the challenges that we have in urban areas. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Doctor. That was absolutely fantastic. I especially like the part where you were talking about the eelgrass plugs. It really lines up with some of the work that my nation and other nations along the coast have been doing. I noticed you focused a lot on an area where I grew up on the mainland there. I grew up in Steveston, so I was very, very lucky to grow up, right across the water from Lulu Island and right in the estuary there. It really raised some concerns that I hadn't really thought about yet. And, the directions that I might need to move with my future. Fast forward, I moved up to Campbell River and got involved with the Waywickham Nation's Ecocultural Estuary Restoration Project, where we were actually transplanting sedge plugs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's very much an interface zone. So, we've got the city butting right up against the estuary, as in a lot of places do. And we have an abundance of Canadian geese that come in, and this is kind of like their mating grounds. They all come here when they molt and whatnot. So we have a small residential population, but when they molt, they all come here and they start picking away at it. So it's really had a damaging effect on our salmon population, rearing habitat and whatnot.
Yeah.
We've gotten into an ecocultural restoration project that's involved alder poles and woven willow, trying to do the same thing as the wattling, just in a different direction. So getting it to sprout and start to grow on site and provide these barriers. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. Is there any questions from anybody else?
I do have my email address here. I would welcome you to contact me at some other time, and we can have a chat, or I can answer questions through email.
Can you hear me, Val? This is Ken Blackburn. Yeah.
Hi, Ken.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. I just had a couple of questions, actually. The first one was when in an earlier slide you were showing kind of an amazing wide variety of tree types in an urban environment. I think you identified 40, and yet as opposed to a natural forest, you might only have 6 or so, I think you said. So how does that huge diversity affect, the insect or bird or soil organisms? Does it also increase diversity for them, or is it encouraging kind of an aggressive, smaller number of species as opposed to a natural forest?
Well, there's nothing better than a natural forest, right? But I think having a lot of different trees, in a small area like that does work its way through the system and benefits the whole system. The only problem is if it invites an invasive species. So, for example, in the east right now, they're having problems with the ash borer, and so that's killed a lot of trees, and they're losing a lot. There's a fungus that's affecting black pine that's starting to move through areas. So if something jumps over to natural species, this is what I'm getting at, native species from one of these introduced species, then that's a problem. But in general, I don't think it is.
Okay, yeah. And this quickly, the other question, are you finding in terms of architectural design, because you did show the library, for example, is it something that's kind of at the forefront of conversations in terms of building buildings within the urban environment? Is it becoming kind of a common discussion as to how to kind of foster diversity and or, for example, reduce bird kills, for example, with windows and things? Is it something that is common, or is it still somewhat rare?
It's common, but it's deceptive. I've had lots of encouraging conversations with landscape architects and developers, and the plans are really good and the direction is really good, and but then at the end, when the plants are the last things to be bought, right? So if there's no money left, then the landscaping suffers, and generally the money is not as good as it should be at the end of a project, and the landscaping suffers. But the rain gardens are quite popular, and they have a lot of priority. So that's where I'm seeing quite a bit of movement and hope.
Yeah, yeah, excellent. Yeah, kind of public art's always left to the end as well. So be kind of nice to see the environment and the arts, join forces there.
Yes. Well, I do like projects with art and nature. Like with some of the projects I've done, we had nature murals because to try and change people's values with facts is really hard. So to talk about all the woes of the environment with all sorts of statistics to try and get people to change their patterns, it doesn't really work in a lot of cases. And what you have to do is speak to their hearts and to get them to change their values that way. And I find that art does that. So we've had mural projects and contests, in terms of art, to try and get people to focus on nature art and change their values that way.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I hope we're recording this because it's certainly something we're trying to do in Campbell River. So that's music to our ears here.
Oh, good.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I had a question. This is Erica. When you talked about sort of the species loss, when you lose the permeability of an area, and in terms of I think there was one slide where you talked about a relationship between the loss of permeability and the loss of species. So you lose the more sensitive species.
Yes.
And I'm just, yeah. Okay, so those more sensitive species, if you take measures to increase the permeability of that area, do they come back, or is it will they repopulate on their own, or is it a major would you have to actually reintroduce them?
I think realistically you would have to reintroduce them because there's already vegetation that's existing there that they would have to compete with to reestablish themselves.
Yeah.
And that's difficult.
Yeah.
If I just jump in, one more question. In terms of animals like rats, for example, or we're hearing raccoons moving in, and more and more. I think we're getting reports of coyotes coming in and things. how are these kind of mammals influencing diversity?
Well,
Or are,
they would have a negative impact, and you sort of have to let the system play out. I guess there's not much you can do directly to discourage them. You know, like in the case of rats that you mentioned, you know, we have, in my neighborhood, we had an old house that was torn down, and I was sure it was full of rats, and the barred owl showed up, and it hung around for a few weeks, and then it disappeared, and the rats sort of diminished it as well. In terms of raccoons, you know, all I can think of is like Stanley Park. They have these explosions of raccoons, and then there's a you know, there's a disease that goes through the population. Their population declines. For the coyotes, I don't think there are these diseases or anything, but you would think that there would be a feedback system at some point, you know, that would keep the populations in check. But it's not a good situation. You're right. You know, there's a lot of competition with the native species and native systems, and they suffer.
cool. Cheers.
Hi, Val. Great to see you.
Oh, hi, Naomi.
Nice to have you in my dining room.
Oh, wow, that's your looks very nice.
Oh, yeah, yes, great. I have a question, and I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but maybe somebody else on the meeting will know. So you talked about impervious spaces and sort of that critical percentage to support biodiversity. Does anybody have an idea of what the impervious areas in Campbell River might be? What our percentage here would be? No. Okay.
Yeah, I certainly don't.
No.
I would have thought it would be like 30%, which is
Okay.
which is what a typical suburb is. But if you went into the downtown area of Campbell River, it'd probably be less.
Yeah, I would expect so. And then we do have some significant green spaces throughout the city, but I don't think enough to really support those sort of greenways and interconnected pieces. But
I would imagine the watersheds are quite large in case of Campbell River. You already have a lot of impervious surface there, so the paved areas, although they're not good, in terms of percentage, they wouldn't really be critical. But I don't.
Right. Me either. But I'm happy to try and put it out there.
Naomi and I used to work together, so.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
It is cool. Actually, Val gave me my first job out of university, and those first few years were like instrumental in pulling me along my career path. So I am forever indebted.
Well, I am too. They were really golden years for me too.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Maybe we can get the number from Sandra. She might know, or she might know how to find out. Yeah.
Yeah, and some of our city folk, would have that number, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Let's find that out. I'm just wondering, Dr. Schaefer, do you have any recommendation now that we have Earth Day this week? Is there anything every one of us, biologists or not, can do to help biodiversity right away? Like, what can we do?
Well, I mean, you can plant some native vegetation. That's the lowest hanging fruit that I can think of. The other is invasive species removal. That's a little more involved, but it's a very typical activity, like around Earth Week and Earth Day, is removing invasives and planting native vegetation. So
everybody just join Greenways.
Yeah.
Endeavors. We'll keep you busy.
Yeah, what Greenways can do is to make sure that it's as strategic as possible, right?
Yeah.
Because the resources are limited, and
yes,
better if you're doing it strategically.
Yeah, we're trying.
Yes.
Trying to have a plan.
I know, good.
Fantastic. Are there any more questions? No. Okay. And I think we'll just say thank you so much. This was great. I'm so inspired. And yeah, thanks for everybody's time to join us during sunshine. That is very special. And we'll put the recording up on YouTube. So if you want to rewatch or share, that would be great. And Dr. Schaefer, this was amazing. Thank you so much for your time and this great presentation.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
And I'll let everybody enjoy the rest of the sunshine out there.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye. Good night, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Val.
Thanks, Leo.
Bye.